It was a bright Saturday morning in the town park, the kind of morning made for families and lemonade and children running in the grass, and nobody there expected to witness anything they would remember for the rest of their lives. The town had put on a small event that day, a salute to service dogs. There were folding tables and paper banners and a modest crowd gathered on the lawn, come to see the retired military and police dogs that a few local families had brought out to be honored. Children knelt to pet graying muzzles. Old handlers told their stories. It was a gentle, ordinary sort of morning. At the edge of that morning, where the mown grass of the park met the cracked sidewalk of the street, stood a man that most of the crowd was trying not to look at. He was homeless. Anyone could see it. His coat was too heavy for the season and worn through at the elbows. His beard was gray and untended, his boots held together with tape, and he carried everything he owned in a canvas bag over one shoulder. He stood at the edge of the lawn the way such men learn to stand, at the margin, apart, taking up as little space in the world as a person can. A few parents drifted their children a little farther from him without quite seeming to. And then the homeless man saw one of the dogs, a lean, dark, aging Belgian Malinois, lying in the grass beside a nice young family, and he went completely still. He stared at that dog for a long time. Something moved across his weathered face, something that made a woman nearby stop and watch him without meaning to. And then, as if he were walking in a dream, the homeless man began to cross the lawn toward that dog. People tensed. A man stepped half in front of his children. The father of the family with the dog rose to his feet, uncertain. And a volunteer in a bright vest started to move to intercept the ragged stranger before he could reach the honored animal. But the homeless man reached the dog first. And he did not lunge, or grab, or do any of the things people were braced for. He lowered himself down onto his knees in the grass, painfully, an arm's length from the old Malinois. And he leaned in close, and out of a throat that sounded like it had not been used in a long while, he whispered a single word. Just one word. So quiet that only the dog could hear it. And what that dog did next stopped every single person in that park cold. I am going to tell you exactly what that one word was, and what it meant, and why it undid a whole crowd of strangers on a Saturday morning. But to understand it, you have to know who that homeless man used to be, and who that dog used to be, and the war they carried together, and the years that tore them apart. So stay with me, all the way to the end. Because some bonds are stronger than distance, stronger than time, stronger even than everything the world can do to break a person down. And this is the story of one of them. The man kneeling in the grass had a name, though it had been a long time since anyone had used it. His name was Tom Bennett. And before he was the man that mothers steered their children away from, before he was a shape at the edge of things that people worked hard not to see, Tom Bennett had been a soldier. A good one. The kind his fellow soldiers would have followed anywhere. But that was a long time ago now, and the world has a short memory for such things. For the last few years, Tom had lived on the streets of that town and the towns around it. He slept where he could, under the overpass when it rained, in the doorway of the shuttered hardware store when it was dry. He had learned all the hard skills of that life, where the shelters were and which ones had beds, which restaurants put their leftovers out and when, how to make himself small and quiet so that the police would move him along gently instead of hard. He was not a drinker, though people assumed he was. He was not dangerous, though people assumed that too. What Tom Bennett was wounded. He carried a wound that no one could see, a wound in the part of a man that does not show up on any scan, and he had been carrying it for years, alone. Every night, no matter how cold, no matter how hungry, Tom did the same thing before he slept. He reached inside his coat, into a pocket he had sewn shut against pickpockets, and he took out the one possession in all the world that he would not part with for anything. It was a photograph. Creased soft as cloth from years of handling, faded almost to nothing. And in it, If you looked closely, you could just make out a younger man in uniform, smiling in hard desert sunlight, with his arm around the neck of a young dark-coated dog. Tom would look at that photograph every night. And then he would put it away, and close his eyes, and try to sleep. It was the last thing he had left of the best thing that had ever happened to him. He had no way of knowing, that ordinary Saturday, that the dog in that photograph was lying in the grass of the town park, not 200 feet away. To understand what Tom Bennett lost, you have to go back to the desert, and to the war, and to the day a young soldier was first handed a leash. Tom had enlisted young, out of a small town not so different from the one where he would one day sleep in doorways. He had wanted, the way a certain kind of good young man wants, to do something that mattered. To be part of something bigger than himself. And the army had seen something in him, a steadiness, a patience, a way with letting things, and they had trained him for one of the most dangerous and most vital jobs in the whole of that war. They made him a dog handler. The military working dog is one of the unsung heroes of every conflict of the modern age. These dogs walk point. They go first, ahead of the soldiers, and they use their extraordinary noses to find the things that kill. The hidden explosives buried in a road. The ambush waiting behind a wall. Time and again, in war after war, it is a dog's nose that saves a whole patrol of men, that finds the death waiting in the dust before it can find them. They are, quite literally, the reason that thousands of soldiers came home who otherwise would not have. And the bond between one of these dogs and his handler is unlike anything in civilian life. It has to be. Because each of them, every single day, places his life entirely in the paws and hands of the other. The soldier trusts the dog to find the danger. The dog trusts the soldier to read him, to protect him, to bring him home. They eat together, sleep together, walk into the valley of the shadow together, and come off the other side together, or not at all. The dog they gave to Tom Bennett was a young Belgian Malinois, all-coiled energy and fierce intelligence, with a dark coat and eyes that seemed to understand more than a dog's eyes should. He had a serial number and an official designation. But a handler always gives his dog a name, a real name, the name that belongs only to the two of them. Tom looked at that fierce, brilliant, waiting young dog on the first day they met, and without quite knowing why, he named him Ranger. Remember that name. Because you are going to hear it again, and when you do, it is going to change everything. They deployed together, and in the crucible of that place, Tom Bennett and the dog named Ranger became one creature. It happened the way it always happens with these teams. Through the long, brutal work of it. Through hundreds of patrols in killing heat, Ranger out front on his lead, nose down, reading the invisible world of scent that no human being will ever perceive, and Tom right behind him, watching every flick of the dog's ears, every shift in his posture, learning to trust the animal's instincts more than his own eyes. Ranger was extraordinary, even among an extraordinary breed. He found things that other dogs missed. He had a stillness, a certainty, that his trainers had never seen. When Ranger stopped and sat and looked back at Tom in a certain way, every man in that patrol stopped moving, because they had all learned what that look meant. It meant, there is death here, right here, and I have found it before it found you. And in the quiet hours between the patrols, when the work was done, the fierce war dog became something else entirely. He became Tom's. He slept pressed against the soldier in the cold desert nights. He rested his head on Tom's chest while the young man wrote letters home he was not sure he would live to send. In a place that stripped everything human away from a man, Ranger was the thing that kept Tom human. He was family, and home, and comfort, and courage, all wrapped up in one dark-coated body, in the middle of a war. There was one day above all others. Tom would never speak of the details, not to anyone, not for years. But the men who were there spoke of it. A patrol that walked into a place it should not have survived. And a dog who, in the last possible instant, threw himself into the danger, who found the thing that would have killed them all, and who paid for it with wounds of his own that nearly ended him. Ranger lived. And because Ranger lived, so did every man on that patrol, Tom Bennett among them. Tom sat up with that dog for 3 nights while he healed, refusing to leave his side, whispering to him in the dark, and the word he whispered, over and over, the word that meant everything they were to each other, was that name. Ranger. Good boy. Ranger. Stay with me. Ranger. They had saved each other's lives more times than either of them could count. They were, in the truest sense that exists, brothers. And in the innocent arithmetic of a young man's heart, Tom Bennett assumed, the way we always assume about the things we cannot imagine losing, that they would always be together. He was wrong. And the way they were torn apart was so sudden, and so cruel, that it broke something in him that would not heal for years. It happened on a day like any other, which is how these things always happen. There was an explosion. There is no gentle way to tell it, so I will tell it plainly and then move on, because the point of this story is not the wound but what came after. Tom Bennett was gravely injured. In an instant, on an ordinary patrol, the war reached out and nearly took his life, and it changed the shape of the rest of it forever. He was evacuated. Unconscious, broken, flown out of that country on a stretcher, from one hospital to another and another, halfway around the world, in the long blur of pain and surgery and medicine that is how the badly wounded come home. And in all of that chaos, in the sudden violent severing of a soldier from the war, one thing happened that Tom Bennett had no power to prevent, and that he did not even fully understand until it was far too late. He never got to say goodbye to Ranger. One moment they were partners, brothers, 2 halves of one whole, out on patrol in the dust. And the next, Tom was gone, spirited away unconscious to the other side of the earth, and Ranger was left behind. Still a serving military dog. Still needed. Reassigned, in the cold language of the paperwork, to a new handler, to go on doing the vital, dangerous work he was trained for. There was no ceremony to it. No chance for the 2 of them to look at each other one last time. The war simply took Tom out and closed the gap behind him, and the dog he loved more than his own life went on into a future that did not include him. When Tom finally came back to himself, weeks later, in a hospital bed in his own country, one of the first coherent things he did was ask about his dog. And they told him, as kindly as they could, that it did not work that way. That Ranger was still in service. That the army was not in the habit of handing over working dogs to wounded soldiers who could no longer care for them. That he should focus on his own recovery. Tom tried. God knows he tried. In the years that followed he wrote letters, made calls, filled out forms, did everything a broken man with no resources and a failing mind could think to do, to find the dog and bring him home. Every path came to nothing. The trail went cold. Only, terribly, Tom Bennett came to understand that Ranger, the one being who had kept him whole through the worst days of his life, was simply gone, out there somewhere in the vast machinery of the world, and that he would almost certainly never see him again. For a man already carrying a wound no one could see, it was one loss too many. And it was the beginning of the long slide down. I want to be careful here, and honest, and kind, because what happened to Tom Bennett happens to more of the men and women who served than any of us likes to admit. He came home a hero, and the world clapped for him, for a little while. And then the clapping stopped, the way it always does, and Tom was left alone with the wound inside him. The war did not stay in the war. It came home with him, and it lived in his sleep, and it lived in the loud sudden sounds that sent him to the floor. And it lived in the terrible hollow feeling that he no longer belonged anywhere in the ordinary world of people who had never seen what he had seen. He had trouble holding a job. Then he had trouble holding an apartment. The relationships that might have caught him frayed and broke under a weight that neither he nor the people who loved him fully understood. He did not fall all at once. Almost nobody does. He fell over years, one handhold at a time, until one day Tom Bennett looked around and realized that he had run out of handholds, and out of people, and out of places to go, and that the street was all that was left. Through all of it, through every cold and hungry night, he kept the photograph. The younger man in the desert sun with his arm around a dark-coated dog. It was the one thing he would not sell, would not lose, would not let go of, no matter how far down he went. Because as long as he had that photograph, some part of Tom Bennett was still that man. Still a soldier. Still somebody's brother. Still loved by something, once, completely. He used to talk to the photograph on the worst nights. He used to whisper that old name into the dark, the way he had whispered it in the desert years before. Ranger. Where are you, boy? Ranger. He never got an answer. For years, he never got an answer. He had no way of knowing that the answer was coming, in the most unlikely place in the world, on an ordinary Saturday morning, in a town park full of strangers. Now I have to tell you the other half of this story. Because while Tom Bennett was falling, the dog named Ranger was living a whole life of his own, and it was a life shaped, in a way that no one around him understood, by a soldier he had lost. Ranger served out his time. He did his dangerous, vital work with his new handlers, and he did it well, because it was in his nature to do it well, and he saved more lives, and he earned an honorable retirement at the end of it, the way the best of these dogs do. And when he retired, a good family adopted him. They were a kind family, the family in the park that Saturday. A young father and mother and their children, people with warm hearts who had wanted to give a retired working dog the soft, safe, comfortable old age that such a dog deserves. They took Ranger into their home and they loved him truly. They gave them a bed by the fire and good food and long walks and a yard full of sun. They did everything right. They also, not knowing his history, gave him a new name. To them he was not Ranger. They called him Duke. It was a fine name, a good name, and the dog answered to it, in time, the way a dog will. But the family noticed something about their new dog, something they could never quite explain, and that troubled them a little, in a quiet way, for all the years they had him. He was always waiting. Duke, as they called him, was a loving dog, a gentle dog, patient with the children, devoted in his way. But there was a distance in him that no amount of love seemed able to close. He would lie for hours by the front window, watching the street, watching every person who passed, as if he were looking for someone. When they took him to the park, or downtown, or anywhere with a crowd, his head would come up and he would scan every face, every single one, with a focus that seemed almost desperate, and then, not finding whatever he was looking for, he would settle again, and something in him would go quiet and sad. The mother of the family said it best, once, watching the old dog stare out the window into the rain. "It's like he's homesick," she said. "But we're his home. Aren't we?" And nobody had an answer for her, because nobody knew that this dog had once belonged, body and soul, to a young man in a desert half a world away, and that some faithful, unkillable part of him had been searching every human face he saw, for years, for the one face that had never come back. Until that Saturday. In the park. When it did. The family had brought Ranger, their Duke, to the salute to service dogs because they were proud of him, and rightly so. He lay in the grass beside them in the bright morning, a distinguished old soldier of a dog, gray now around his dark muzzle, tolerating the hands of children with the patience of his years. People admired him. The father told a little of his service history, the parts he knew. It was a good morning, a gentle morning, and the old dog seemed content, dozing in the warm sun. And then something changed. It was the family who noticed it first. Duke's head came up off the grass. Not the ordinary way, at some passing sound. His whole body came alive in a way they had not seen in years, a sudden electric alertness, his ears straining forward, his nose working the air. And his gaze had locked onto something at the far edge of the lawn. A ragged figure. A homeless man in a heavy coat, standing at the margin of the crowd, staring back at him. The old dog began to tremble. Across the lawn, Tom Bennett was having the strangest experience of his life. He had drifted toward the park that morning the way he drifted most places, without a real destination, drawn only by some dim pull toward the sound of a gathering, the warmth of a crowd. And then he had seen the dogs, and his heart had done the small painful thing it always did at the sight of a dog, the old grief stirring. And then he had seen one dog in particular, a graying dark Malinois lying in the grass, and the whole world had simply stopped. He knew that dog. He knew him the way you know your own hand. Older now, gray now, but there was no mistaking the shape of him, the set of his ears, the specific darkness of his coat, the eyes. Tom's own eyes, which had seen so much and wept over so little in all those hard years, filled without warning. It could not be. It could not possibly be. Across a whole world, across all those years, across everything that had happened. It could not be. But it was. And so a homeless veteran began to walk across a sunlit lawn toward a dog that half a crowd of strangers were suddenly, nervously watching him approach. They were afraid of him. That is the plain truth of it, and there is no shame in it, only sorrow. They saw a ragged, weathered stranger walking with strange intensity toward an honored old dog and a family with small children, and they did what people do, they tensed, they moved to protect, they got ready to stop him. The volunteer in the bright vest started forward. The father rose to his feet, putting himself between the stranger and his children. A murmur of alarm went through the little crowd. But the dog. The dog was straining now against his lead, not in fear, not in aggression, but in something none of them had ever seen, a whole-bodied, desperate pulling toward the approaching man, a high thin sound rising out of him that was almost a cry. The father looked down at his dog, this calm and gentle old dog, now shaking and whining and pulling with all his aging strength toward a homeless stranger, and something made him hesitate. Something made him not pull the dog back. Something in the old animal's desperate joy made the whole moment go strange and still. Tom Bennett reached the dog. He was weeping openly now, this hard, weathered man, tears running down into his gray beard, and he paid no attention to the wary crowd or the frightened parents or the volunteer hovering at his shoulder. He had eyes only for the dog. He lowered himself down onto his knees in the grass, his old injuries making it a labor, until he was down at the dog's level, an arm's length away, close enough to see the old scars under the graying fur, the scars he remembered, the scars from the day the dog had saved them all. And Tom Bennett leaned in, and through a throat closed tight with a decade of grief, he whispered the one word he had whispered into the dark on 1,000 lonely nights, the word that had meant home, and family, and brother, and love, the truest word he had ever known. "Ranger," he whispered. "Ranger. It's me." And the dog came undone. At the sound of that name, that old name, the name no living soul in that park had ever spoken, the name he had not heard in all the long years of his second life, something broke open in the old dog like a dam giving way. He stopped being Duke, the family's gentle retiree, and became, all at once, entirely and completely, Ranger again. He lunged forward the last few feet and pressed his whole trembling body against the kneeling man, and he buried his gray face in the stranger's neck, and the sounds that came out of him were sounds that made grown adults in that crowd turn away and cover their mouths. He climbed half into Tom's lap, all 90 pounds of him, the way he had as a young dog in the desert, and he pressed and pushed and whined and licked the tears from the old soldier's face, and his whole body shook with a joy too large to contain. Tom Bennett wrapped both arms around the dog he had lost a lifetime ago, and he held on, and he broke, finally, completely, all the grief of all those years pouring out of him at once into that dark fur, and he said the name over and over like a prayer answered after all hope was gone. "Ranger. Ranger. I found you. I found you, boy. I found you." And the whole park had gone silent. Every single person. The children, the parents, the volunteers, the family who had loved this dog and never understood the sadness in him. They stood frozen on that sunlit lawn, watching a ragged homeless man and an old war dog weep in each other's arms, and not one of them, not one, had a dry eye, because even before they knew a single fact of the story, they understood in their bones that they were witnessing something holy. They were watching a love that had crossed a whole world and a decade of loss and refused, absolutely refused, to die. It came oddly, there on the lawn, in the tender chaos that followed. The family, kneeling now beside the two of them, gently asking. Tom, wiping his eyes, pulling from his coat the one thing he owned, the soft creased photograph, and holding it out with a shaking hand. And the father taking it, and looking at the young soldier in the desert sun with his arm around a young dark-coated dog, and looking at the weeping man before him, and looking at his own old dog wrapped around that man, and understanding, all at once, the whole shape of the thing. The dog they had loved for years. The dog who had always been waiting, always watching the road, always searching every face. He had been searching for this. For him. For the soldier he had lost in a war half a world away. All those years the family had wondered at the sadness in their gentle dog, and here, kneeling in the grass in a torn coat, was the answer. Here was the missing piece. Here was the reason the old dog had never quite been able to rest. The mother of the family was crying too hard to speak. The father knelt there with the photograph in his hands, and he looked at his wife, and some silent thing passed between them, the way it does between people who love each other and know, both at once, what the right thing is even when it costs them. Because they did love that dog. Truly. And what came next was not easy for them, and I will not pretend it was. But they were good people. And good people, when they are shown plainly what is right, find a way to do it. What happened after that Saturday is the part of the story that restores your faith in people. Because the crowd that had witnessed it would not let it end there. This was a small town, and word of what had happened in the park that morning spread through it like light. The homeless veteran and the war dog he had lost. The one word. The reunion on the lawn that had brought 100 strangers to tears. People who had spent years walking past Tom Bennett without seeing him now could not stop seeing him. They had watched him weep into that dog's fur, and they could no longer pretend he was invisible, because they had seen, all at once, the whole man he was, and the whole man he had been, and everything the world owed him and had never paid. The town rose up around Tom Bennett. There is no other way to say it. A veterans organization got involved, and then another. People who knew how to navigate the systems that Tom had drowned in for years took his hand and walked him through them. Within weeks, a man who had been sleeping in doorways had a roof over his head, and help for the wound inside him, the wound he had carried alone for so long, and the beginnings, for the first time in years, of a way back into the world of the living. And the family. The good family who had loved that dog and given him a soft old age. They did the hardest and the most beautiful thing of all. They gave him back. They understood, once they knew the truth, that the dog had never really been Duke. He had always, in the deepest part of himself, been Ranger, and he had always belonged to the soldier he had spent his whole second life waiting to find. And so, with tears in their eyes and grace in their hearts, they let him go home to where he had always been trying to get. They did not lose a dog that day, the father said later. They gave a soldier back his brother. And they got to be part of the best thing they would ever do. Tom Bennett and Ranger got their years after all. Not the years the war stole from them. Those were gone, and no one could give them back. But the years that were left, the quiet ones, the gentle ones, the ones after all the fighting was finally over, those they got to spend together, and they made the most of every single one. The wound inside Tom did not vanish. Wounds like that never fully do. But it is a different thing to carry a wound alone in a doorway in the cold, and to carry it in a warm home with your oldest friend asleep at the foot of your bed. Ranger did for Tom, in those last years, the same thing he had done in the desert so long ago. He kept him human. He gave them a reason to get up in the morning, a warm body to come home to, a living creature who needed him and loved him without condition or question. Men who had tried for years to reach Tom Bennett, counselors and caseworkers and fellow veterans, all said the same thing. It was the dog. The dog was the medicine that finally worked. The dog gave him back to himself. And Ranger, at long last, stopped waiting. The family who had loved him used to visit sometimes, and they marveled at the change in him. The old dog who had spent years staring out windows and searching crowds for a face that never came, that dog was gone. In his place was a peaceful, contented old soldier who did not watch the road anymore, because everything he had been searching for was finally in the room with him. He had found his person. Or rather, his person had found him, on a Saturday morning, in a town park, and had knelt down in the grass and whispered the one word that called him all the way home. They had the years they had. And when the end finally came for Ranger, as it comes for all these faithful hearts far too soon, he went the way every one of them should be so lucky to go. Old, and warm, and safe, and loved, with his head resting on the chest of the soldier who had never stopped looking for him, who held him through that last quiet night and whispered the old name into his fur one final time, the way he had in the desert all those years before. Ranger. Good boy. Ranger. I'm here. I'm here. He was not alone. Not at the end. Neither of them ever would be again. So that is the story of a homeless veteran and the one word that brought his brother home. Of everything in it, of the whole long journey through war and loss and all those hard years in the cold, here is the moment I cannot let go of. It is that instant on the sunlit lawn. It is the sight of a broken man kneeling in the grass to whisper a single word, a name, into the ear of an old dog that a whole crowd of strangers was afraid of him touching. And it is what that word did. How one word, spoken with love, reached across a decade of separation and half a world of distance and called a lost soul all the way home. Ranger. That was the word. Just a name. But it was everything. Because that is the thing about the bonds that truly matter. They do not keep track of the time that passes, or the miles in between, or all the ways the world tries to wear them down. Tom Bennett lost everything a man can lose. His health, his home, his place in the world, very nearly his own hope. But he never lost the one thing that mattered most, the love between him and his dog, and in the end that one thing, carried faithfully through all those years by both of them, was enough to save them both. The dog spent his whole second life searching for the soldier. The soldier spent his whole broken life keeping his soft photograph next to his heart. And neither one of them ever gave up. Neither one of them ever stopped believing the other was still out there, somewhere, waiting. There is someone in your life, maybe, who has loved you like that. With that kind of stubborn, patient, unkillable faithfulness. Someone who would search every face in every crowd for the rest of their life, just to find yours. Whether they walk on 2 legs or on 4, do not let this day end without letting them know that you see them, and that you would search for them too. Because a love that faithful is the rarest thing there is in this whole hard world. And most of us are given far fewer chances than we think to hold on to it. And if you have ever passed a ragged stranger at the edge of a crowd, and looked away, remember Tom Bennett. Remember that every one of those invisible souls was somebody's brother once. Somebody's hero. Somebody the world clapped for, before it forgot. You never know what whole life, what whole love, what whole war, is being carried inside the person you are trying not to see. If this story touched your heart, do me a kindness and leave a comment below. Tell me about the most faithful soul you have ever known, and tell me their name. I read every single one, and those comments mean more to me than I can say. And if you believe, the way I do, that a love like this deserves to be remembered, then give this video a like so more people get to hear it, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded today that it is never too late to be found. If you are new here, and you love true stories about loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between people and the dogs who would cross the whole world to find them, then subscribe and stay with us. Every week, I bring you another story, told all the way through, from beginning to end. Next time, I want to tell you about an old retired canine living out his quiet years on a farm, who woke his family in the dead of night, barking at a locked door that had never been opened, and would not stop until they finally understood what he had been trying to tell them all along. Until then, look a little closer at the ones the world walks past.